Picture this. You're scrolling through medieval history thinking peasants just died when food ran out. Simple, right? Wrong. These people had survival strategies that would make modern preppers weep with envy. They ate tree bark like it was artisanal sourdough, turned leather boots into soup, and somehow kept entire communities alive on what we'd consider yard waste. While you're stressed about your DoorDash being 20 minutes late, medieval peasants were performing actual miracles with moldy grain and grass. Tonight, we're diving into the darkly fascinating world of famine survival, and trust me, it gets weird. If you're here for the kind of history that makes you grateful for your midnight snacks, hit that subscribe button. Your brain will thank you for the education. Let's start with a comfortable truth. Famine wasn't just no food. That's like saying the Titanic had a small leak. Medieval famine was a complex, multi-layered catastrophe that required the kind of resourcefulness we've completely forgotten in our age of 24-hour grocery stores and emergency pizza delivery. The year is 1315. Europe is entering what historians cheerfully call the Great Famine. 7 years of crop failures, livestock death, and general agricultural apocalypse. But here's where it gets interesting. People didn't just lie down and accept death. They got creative, disturbingly, impressively creative. Take the village of Montaillou in southern France. When the grain stores ran empty, the villagers didn't panic buy toilet paper. They systematically catalogued every edible thing within a day's walk. Acorns became flour, tree bark became bread, grass became salad. They turned survival into a science. Modern food security experts study these medieval strategies today, and honestly, we've gotten soft. When your local Whole Foods runs out of quinoa, you drive to another Whole Foods. When a medieval peasant ran out of grain, they learned to make bread from ground-up tree roots, and somehow made it taste decent enough that their children didn't revolt. The psychological aspect fascinates me more than the practical one. These weren't desperate people making desperate choices. Well, they were, but they approached it with methodical precision. Village elders would hold councils to discuss forage rotation. They'd assign different families to different food sources to prevent overharvesting. They created elaborate sharing systems that ensured the weakest members got fed first, because keeping everyone alive meant keeping the community's labor force intact. But let's talk about what they actually ate, because this is where medieval ingenuity gets both impressive and deeply unsettling. Bread made from acorn flour and sawdust. Soup made from boiled leather, and not just any leather, but specifically leather that had been treated with certain tannins that wouldn't poison you. They knew the difference. They had to. There's a record from a monastery in Bavaria describing a famine feast, where the monks served what they called forest bread, a mixture of ground bark, moss, and whatever nuts they could find, baked with just enough actual flour to hold it together. The chronicler notes that it was surprisingly palatable, and that the community considered it a delicacy by the 3rd month of the famine. Think about that for a moment. They didn't just survive on tree bark, they learned to make it taste good. While we complain about gluten-free options, medieval peasants were perfecting recipes for foods that didn't technically qualify as food. The social dynamics were equally complex. Famine brought out both the best and worst in people, but mostly it brought out pragmatism. Families would pool resources with neighbors, not out of altruism, but because isolated families died faster than connected ones. The phrase "it takes a village" wasn't inspirational, it was literal survival strategy. And here's something that would blow modern minds. They planned for famine during good years. Medieval peasants maintained what we'd now call disaster preparation protocols. They knew which plants in their area were edible, but normally avoided. They knew how to preserve foods using methods that wouldn't waste precious salt or fuel. They maintained seed stocks specifically for emergency planting of fast-growing, low-nutrition crops that could keep people alive until real food returned. Women, particularly, developed an encyclopedic knowledge of every edible plant within miles of their homes. They could identify dozens of varieties of mushrooms, knew which berries were safe in which seasons, understood the difference between nutritious tree barks and poisonous ones. This wasn't casual gardening knowledge. This was life-or-death botanical expertise passed down through generations. The children learned early. By age 7, most peasant children could identify emergency food sources and help with basic food preparation, not because childhood was harsh, though it was, but because survival knowledge was considered as essential as learning to walk. But here's what really gets me. They maintained hope. Chronicles from famine years don't just record death and desperation. They record festivals, marriages, births, celebrations. People adapted their joy along with their diets. They found reasons to celebrate tiny victories. A successful forage, a neighbor's recovery, the first signs of returning wildlife that indicated the famine might be ending. Let that settle in your mind as we move forward. These weren't grim people, grimly surviving. They were humans being remarkably creatively human under impossible circumstances. Now that we've established that medieval peasants were basically survival ninjas, let's talk about the economy that emerged when regular food disappeared. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about famine. It doesn't just change what people eat, it completely reshapes how society functions. Imagine if Bitcoin, but instead of cryptocurrency, it was literally turnips. That's essentially what happened during extended famines. Normal currency became meaningless when there was nothing to buy, so communities developed elaborate barter systems based on caloric value and survival utility. A handful of nuts might be worth a day's labor. A chunk of preserved meat could buy protection for a family. Information about food sources became more valuable than gold. Literally, because you can't eat gold, a fact that apparently medieval peasants understood better than modern cryptocurrency enthusiasts. The village of Loris in northern France kept detailed records during the famine of 1346, and reading them is like peeking into an alternate economic universe. A single egg was worth 3 days of skilled labor. A cup of wheat flour could secure someone's livestock feeding rights for a week. Children traded stories about food locations, like modern kids trade Pokemon cards, except the stakes were slightly higher, like survival higher. But here's where medieval pragmatism gets really interesting. They developed credit systems based on future harvests. Peasants would literally mortgage their post-famine labor for present-day calories. I'll work your fields for 3 months after the harvest returns, if you give my family soup today. These weren't informal agreements. Villagers kept meticulous records of famine debts, and they were considered as binding as any legal contract. The church played a fascinating role in this underground economy. Monasteries became medieval food banks, but with complex theological accounting. They'd distribute food to the starving, but recipients were expected to provide either labor, prayer, or future tithes in return. Nothing was free, not because the church was heartless, but because sustainable charity required sustainable systems. There's a beautiful irony in reading these records. The same people modern history books describe as ignorant peasants were operating sophisticated economic networks that would make modern logistics managers jealous. They tracked seasonal food patterns, managed complex debt relationships, and maintained supply chains across multiple villages, all while slowly starving. Women emerged as crucial players in this shadow economy. They typically managed household food stores and had extensive knowledge of food preservation, making them natural intermediaries in famine trading. A woman who could stretch a handful of grain into 3 days of meals became a community asset. They developed networks for sharing preservation techniques, pooling resources, and managing group foraging expeditions. These weren't just survival groups, they were sophisticated business operations. Women would specialize in different aspects of famine management. Some became expert foragers, others mastered food preservation, others specialized in textile work that could be traded for food. They created medieval guilds, dedicated to not dying, and honestly, that's more organized than most modern disaster response. The psychological economics fascinate me too. Communities developed elaborate social protocols around food sharing that balanced individual survival with group stability. They created shame-based systems for hoarding, honor-based systems for sharing, and complex social hierarchies that prioritize different types of contribution. The village blacksmith might get extra rations not because he was more important as a person, but because keeping him alive meant maintaining tool repair capabilities that everyone would need post-famine. Children occupied a unique position in this economy. They were simultaneously the most protected and most economically active members of society. Protected because communities understood that losing children meant losing their future. Economically active because their small size made them excellent foragers. They could reach food sources adults couldn't access and required fewer calories to maintain. But here's the darkest part of the famine economy, and we need to address it directly. Not every family made it through intact. When resources became absolutely critical, communities faced impossible decisions about resource allocation. Medieval records are surprisingly honest about this. Some villages developed formal protocols for prioritizing survival, age, health status, family size, community contribution, all became factors in life or death resource decisions. Yet even in these extreme circumstances, they maintained social structures that protected the most vulnerable when possible. Many communities developed adoption systems where surviving families would take in orphaned children, not just out of compassion, but because children represented future labor and community continuity. The truly remarkable thing is how quickly these emergency economies dissolved once regular food returned. When harvests recovered, communities didn't gradually transition back to normal commerce. They snapped back almost overnight. Famine debts were honored, emergency partnerships dissolved amicably, and the complex survival networks faded back into normal village social structures. It's like they understood that famine economics were emergency protocols, not permanent social changes. They could operate sophisticated survival systems under extreme stress, then return to normal life without the trauma destroying their social fabric. Modern disaster psychology studies these medieval recovery patterns because they're frankly better at post-crisis social healing than most contemporary communities. Think about that as you consider your own relationship with scarcity and abundance. These people lived with the constant possibility of famine, yet they built systems that were simultaneously flexible enough for survival and stable enough for recovery. Alright, let's get into the weeds, literally, because when regular food disappears, everything becomes a potential meal, and medieval peasants turned foraging into an art form that would make modern survivalists weep with inadequacy. First, let's dispel a myth. Medieval people weren't randomly grabbing plants and hoping for the best. They had botanical knowledge that rivaled trained herbalists. Every village had individuals who could identify dozens of edible plants, knew their seasonal availability, understood their nutritional content, and crucially knew how to prepare them safely. Take stinging nettles. Modern hikers avoid them like medieval plague victims avoided, plague victims. But peasants harvested nettles as a primary green vegetable during famines. They knew that young nettle leaves, properly cooked, lose their sting, and provide essential nutrients that prevent scurvy. They developed specific harvesting techniques using wooden tools and cloth wrappings that allowed efficient collection without injury. But here's where it gets impressive. They understood plant ecology well enough to harvest sustainably, even during desperate times. Village foraging was managed communally to prevent overharvesting. Different families were assigned different areas and different plants to ensure that food sources remained available throughout the famine period. The knowledge was incredibly specific. They didn't just know acorns are edible. They knew which oak varieties produced the least bitter acorns, when to harvest them for optimal nutrition, how long to leach the tannins to make them palatable, and how to grind and process them into flour that could be stored for months. Dandelions weren't weeds, they were vegetables. Every part of the dandelion plant was used: leaves for bitter greens, roots for coffee-like beverages, flowers for wine when resources allowed. Peasants could identify the optimal growth stage for each part of the plant, and new techniques for reducing bitterness through blanching and proper preparation. Tree bark sounds horrifying to modern palates, but medieval foragers had sophisticated knowledge about which trees produced edible bark and how to prepare it. Birch bark could be dried and ground into flour. Pine inner bark could be cooked into nutritious, if resinous, porridge. They knew which trees to harvest from without killing the tree, because dead trees don't produce bark next year. The mushroom knowledge was particularly impressive, considering that mushroom identification errors are fatal. Village foragers maintained detailed knowledge of dozens of mushroom varieties, knew their seasons, understood their habitat requirements, and had elaborate protocols for testing questionable specimens. They developed preservation techniques for drying and storing mushrooms that would keep them edible for months. But let's talk about the plants that sound absolutely insane to modern eaters. Plantain leaves were processed into nutritious porridge. Clover flowers were dried and ground into flour extender. Rose hips were collected and processed into vitamin-rich preserves. Cattail roots were harvested, dried and ground into starchy flour. Every boggy area, every forest edge, every meadow was a potential grocery store to trained foragers. The seasonal knowledge was encyclopedic. Spring foraging focused on tender young greens and tree saps. Summer brought berries, seeds, and mature leaves. Fall was nut and root harvest time. Winter foraging meant knowing which plants remained nutritious under snow and which preserved foods were still safe to consume. Women typically held the most extensive foraging knowledge, passing detailed information down through generations of daughters. This wasn't casual nature appreciation. This was systematic botanical education that could mean the difference between family survival and starvation. Young girls learned to identify dozens of plants before they learned to read, because reading was optional, but plant identification was essential. The preparation techniques were as sophisticated as the identification skills. Raw acorns are bitter and mildly toxic, but properly processed acorn flour is nutritious and palatable. The processing involved multiple rounds of grinding, leaching in running water, and careful drying techniques that had been refined over generations of famine survival. They understood plant chemistry intuitively. They knew which plants required cooking to be digestible, which needed fermentation to be safe, which could be eaten raw, and which provided essential nutrients missing from their limited grain-based diet. They could identify plants that provided vitamin C, iron, protein, and other essential nutrients when conventional foods weren't available. The tool development was equally impressive. They created specialized baskets for different types of foraging, developed digging tools optimized for root collection, and maintained sharpened knives specifically for plant harvesting. These weren't improvised solutions. They were refined tools passed down through generations of foragers. But here's what really impresses me. They maintained detailed mental maps of foraging locations across vast areas. A skilled forager could navigate to dozens of specific locations where particular plants grew, remember the seasonal timing for optimal harvest, and plan multi-day foraging expeditions that maximized caloric return while minimizing energy expenditure. The social protocols around foraging were complex too. Communities had rules about which areas could be foraged by whom, protocols for sharing particularly valuable discoveries, and systems for teaching foraging skills to newcomers. Hoarding prime foraging locations during famine was considered a serious social offense. They even understood the nutritional timing of wild foods. Nuts were collected in fall not just because that's when they ripen, but because the high fat content provided essential calories for surviving winter months. Spring greens were prioritized, not just for their availability, but because they provided vitamins that prevented nutrient deficiency diseases after months of limited diet. Modern nutritionists studying medieval famine diets are consistently surprised by how well-balanced these emergency food systems were. Peasants intuitively combined foods to create complete protein profiles and ensure essential nutrient intake, all while working with plants most modern people wouldn't recognize as food. Let that knowledge settle as we explore how they turned these foraged ingredients into actual meals that people could not only survive on, but sometimes even enjoy. Welcome to the most underrated chemistry lab in human history, the medieval peasant kitchen during famine. These people turned food science into literal life science, creating meals from ingredients that would make modern chefs quit their jobs and become accountants. Let's start with bread, because bread was life. Even when bread wasn't technically bread anymore, when wheat flour disappeared, medieval bakers didn't just give up and switch to crackers. They became masters of what we might generously call creative grain substitution. A typical famine bread might contain 1 part actual flour, if available, 1 part ground acorn meal, 1 part sawdust from specific trees. Yes, they knew which trees produced edible sawdust, and various plant meals ground from roots, seeds, and dried vegetables. The result wasn't Wonder Bread, but it was bread-shaped, bread-textured, and most importantly, it provided calories that kept people alive. The technique for creating these survival breads was remarkably sophisticated. They understood fermentation well enough to maintain sourdough starters that could leaven even heavily adulterated flour mixtures. They knew how to adjust baking times and temperatures for different ingredient combinations. They could predict how various plant additives would affect texture, flavor, and digestibility. But bread was just the beginning. Medieval famine cooking developed an entire cuisine around turning the barely edible into the actively nutritious. Take bone soup. Not just throwing bones into water, but a systematic process for extracting every possible nutrient from animal bones that had already been used for other purposes. The process involved roasting bones to develop flavor, then slow cooking them for days to extract marrow, collagen, and minerals. They added wild herbs not just for flavor, but because they understood that certain plants enhanced nutrient absorption, and others provided essential vitamins missing from their limited diet. The resulting broth was nutrient-dense enough to sustain people through extended periods when solid food was scarce. Preservation techniques during famine were advanced chemistry disguised as folk knowledge. They understood salt ratios for different types of preservation, knew how to create controlled fermentation environments, and could dry foods using techniques that maximized shelf life while maintaining nutritional value. Smoking wasn't just about flavor. They knew which woods provided antimicrobial properties that extended food safety. They understood that certain smoking techniques could make marginal foods safer to consume and could enhance the digestibility of tough plant materials. The fermentation knowledge was particularly impressive. They could ferment virtually anything that contained carbohydrates, creating alcoholic beverages that were safer to drink than water and provided calories when food was scarce. But more importantly, they understood that fermentation could make otherwise indigestible plant materials nutritious and safe. Sauerkraut production during famine used wild plants instead of cabbage. They fermented tree leaves, root vegetables, and even certain grasses, creating preserved foods that provided essential probiotics and vitamins during long winters when fresh food was unavailable. The spice and herb usage during famine reveals sophisticated understanding of both nutrition and food safety. Certain herbs weren't just flavoring, they were medicine and preservation rolled into one. Garlic, when available, provided antimicrobial properties that could make questionable foods safer. Wild herbs provided essential nutrients and masked the bitter flavors of emergency foods. But let's talk about the cooking methods, because medieval famine cooking required techniques that maximized fuel efficiency while creating palatable meals from terrible ingredients. One-pot cooking wasn't just convenient, it was essential when fuel was scarce and ingredients needed extensive cooking to be digestible. They developed slow cooking techniques that could break down tough plant materials using minimal fuel. They understood how to layer ingredients in cooking pots to maximize flavor development and ensure even cooking. They knew which ingredients needed longer cooking times and which could be added later to preserve their nutritional content. The water management was crucial too. When clean water was scarce, they knew how to cook foods in ways that purified water while preparing meals. Boiling grains and vegetables served double duty, creating nutritious meals and providing safe drinking water. Temperature control without thermometers required remarkable skill. They could judge cooking temperatures by hand, by smell, by sound, and by visual cues. They knew exactly how long different types of emergency foods needed to cook to be safe and digestible, and they could adjust cooking times based on fuel availability and ingredient quality. The meal timing and portion control during famine reveals understanding of both nutrition and psychology. They didn't just divide available food equally. They understood that certain family members needed more calories at specific times, that eating small frequent meals preserved energy better than large infrequent ones, and that the psychological satisfaction of proper meals helped maintain morale during extended hardship. Communal cooking became essential during severe famines, not just for fuel efficiency, but because pooling ingredients and cooking expertise resulted in better meals than individual families could create alone. Village cooking rotations ensured that skilled cooks could maximize the nutritional value of everyone's limited ingredients. The creativity extended to cooking tools and techniques. When metal cookware wasn't available, they knew how to cook effectively using stone, clay, and wood. They could create steam cooking environments using heated stones and wet leaves. They understood how to use hot ashes for slow, even cooking of root vegetables and grains. But here's what really impresses me about medieval famine cooking. They maintained food culture even under extreme circumstances. They didn't just create calories, they created meals that maintained social bonds and psychological well-being. Shared meals remained social events, even when the meals consisted of tree bark porridge and wild green soup. They understood that the act of cooking, the smells, the communal preparation, the shared consumption, was as important for survival as the nutrition itself. Food remained a source of comfort and connection, even when the food itself was barely recognizable as such. Modern food scientists studying these medieval techniques consistently find that peasant famine cooking created surprisingly complete nutrition profiles using ingredients that individually provided limited nutritional value. The combination techniques they developed maximized bioavailability of nutrients and created synergistic effects that enhanced overall nutrition. Here's something that'll keep you awake tonight in the best possible way. Medieval children didn't just survive famine, they became tiny experts in survival, developing skills and knowledge that would put modern wilderness guides to shame. And somehow they managed to remain children while doing it. Picture a 7-year-old who can identify edible mushrooms, knows which tree barks are safe to eat, understands seasonal foraging patterns, and can prepare emergency meals that actually taste decent. That wasn't exceptional, that was Tuesday for medieval peasant children during famine years. But let's start with how families approached feeding children when there wasn't enough food to feed everyone. Modern thinking might assume parents simply divided food equally, but medieval families understood child nutrition in ways that would surprise contemporary pediatricians. Children received priority for certain types of foods, not just because parents loved their children, but because they understood that growing bodies had different nutritional requirements than adult bodies. When milk was available, children got it first. When eggs could be found, children got them. When any animal protein became available, children received priority portions. This wasn't sentimentality. It was practical understanding that protein deficiency in growing children caused permanent damage, while adults could recover from temporary protein shortages. The education system during famine was fascinating. Children learned survival skills alongside traditional knowledge, but the survival education was systematic and comprehensive. They weren't just told eat this plant. They learned to identify plants at different growth stages, understand seasonal availability, recognize similar-looking dangerous plants, and master preparation techniques that made food safe and palatable. A typical day for a child during famine might include formal plant identification lessons with their mothers or grandmothers, practical foraging expeditions where they learn to find and harvest emergency foods, and cooking lessons where they practice turning gathered ingredients into actual meals. This wasn't child labor, it was survival education that treated children as capable learners rather than helpless dependents. The psychological adaptation was remarkable. Children developed what modern psychologists might call flexible food schemas. They learned to find satisfaction and even enjoyment in foods that would horrify modern children. They celebrated small food discoveries, found genuine pleasure in well-prepared emergency meals, and maintained positive relationships with food, even when food was scarce and strange. Village communities recognized that children were the future, so child survival became a community responsibility rather than just a family obligation. Skilled foragers would take groups of children on educational expeditions. Experienced cooks would teach children food preparation techniques. Community members with specialized survival knowledge would ensure that children learned those skills before the knowledge was lost. But here's what's really beautiful. Children remained children, even during these extreme circumstances. They played games based on foraging, hide and seek using plant identification, competitions to see who could find the most edible plants, imaginative games that incorporated survival skills into childhood play. They found ways to make survival education fun and engaging. The social dynamics among children during famine were complex, but generally cooperative. Children understood that sharing knowledge and resources increased everyone's survival chances. They developed peer networks for sharing food discoveries, teaching each other identification skills, and providing mutual support during particularly difficult periods. Older children took responsibility for teaching younger children, creating multi-generational learning systems that ensured survival knowledge was constantly being passed down and reinforced. A 10-year-old might be responsible for teaching 3 or 4 younger children basic plant identification, while learning more advanced techniques from teenagers and adults. The creativity children brought to famine survival was often superior to adult solutions. Their smaller size allowed them access to food sources adults couldn't reach. Their natural curiosity led them to discover new edible plants that adults might overlook. Their willingness to experiment with flavors and preparation techniques sometimes resulted in genuinely improved recipes for emergency foods. Children also served as community messengers and scouts, traveling between families and villages to share information about food sources, trade opportunities, and survival techniques. Their mobility and social connections made them valuable members of the famine survival network, not just dependents who needed protection. The psychological resilience children developed during famine was remarkable. They learned to find satisfaction in small victories, maintain hope during extended hardship, and derive pleasure from simple foods and basic comforts. These weren't traumatized children grimly enduring hardship. They were adaptable humans learning to thrive under difficult circumstances. Parents worked hard to maintain childhood joy and wonder even during famine. They created celebrations around successful foraging expeditions, turned food preparation into engaging activities, and found ways to make even emergency meals feel special and satisfying. They understood that maintaining children's emotional health was as important as maintaining their physical health. The learning extended beyond just food and survival. Children learned advanced planning skills, understanding how to think seasonally and prepare for future challenges. They developed a sophisticated understanding of community cooperation, resource management, and mutual support systems. They learned practical skills like tool making, food storage, and basic medicine. But they also learned cultural knowledge, stories, songs, traditions that maintained community identity and provided emotional comfort during difficult times. Grandparents and elders made special efforts to ensure that cultural knowledge wasn't lost during crisis periods, understanding that maintaining cultural continuity was essential for long-term community survival. The recovery process for children after famine was generally positive. Most children adapted quickly back to normal food and normal childhood activities without apparent long-term trauma. The skills they learned during famine remained valuable throughout their lives, but didn't seem to create lasting anxiety or food insecurity issues. Modern child development experts studying medieval famine recovery are consistently surprised by how well children bounced back from extended periods of food scarcity and emergency living. The community support systems and the way survival education was integrated into normal childhood development seemed to protect children from the psychological trauma that might be expected from such extreme circumstances. What emerges from these historical records is a picture of childhood that's both more challenging and more empowering than modern childhood. Children were expected to be capable, contributing members of their communities, but they were also protected and nurtured in ways that allowed them to maintain the curiosity, creativity, and joy that characterizes healthy childhood development. Let's talk about something that'll make you appreciate your thermostat. Staying warm during medieval famine, when food was scarce, fuel was precious, and your metabolism was already compromised by malnutrition. Spoiler alert, medieval peasants turned thermodynamics into a survival art form. First, let's establish the baseline challenge. When you're not getting enough calories, your body reduces heat production to conserve energy. When fuel is too expensive or scarce to burn for warmth, you can't compensate with external heat. When you're spending more energy foraging and working to survive, you're burning calories you don't have while generating body heat you can't maintain. It's like trying to heat a house with a broken furnace during a power outage while someone's stealing your blankets. Medieval peasants solved this through what we might call collaborative thermodynamics. Instead of each family attempting to heat individual spaces, communities developed shared warming strategies that maximized heat efficiency while minimizing fuel consumption. The most obvious solution was shared sleeping arrangements, but this went far beyond just everyone piled together. They understood thermal layering, air circulation, body heat distribution, and insulation techniques that modern camping enthusiasts would envy. Multiple families might share a single room, with careful attention to positioning people based on their individual heat production. Children and elderly people in the center, where they'd receive maximum warmth, healthy adults around the perimeter, where they could generate and share heat. But the real genius was in their fuel conservation techniques. They developed heating methods that maximized heat output while minimizing fuel consumption, using principles that modern efficiency experts still study. Instead of burning wood directly for heat, they'd create charcoal first, which burned hotter and longer with less fuel. They understood thermal mass heating stones during the day and using them to provide warmth throughout the night. Clothing strategies during famine was sophisticated systems engineering, disguised as folk knowledge. They layered clothing using air-trapping techniques that maximized insulation while allowing moisture management. They understood which fabrics retained heat when wet, which materials provided the best insulation to weight ratios, and how to modify clothing to seal heat while maintaining mobility. The textile recycling during famine was remarkably advanced. When new clothing wasn't available, they disassembled and reassembled existing textiles to maximize warmth efficiency. They could turn one adult garment into multiple child garments, combine different fabric types to create superior insulation properties, and modify clothing to address specific thermal challenges. Shared body heat wasn't just about sleeping arrangements. They developed communal activities that generated warmth while accomplishing necessary tasks. Group food preparation sessions provided shared warmth while creating meals. Communal textile work sessions allowed people to stay warm while maintaining and creating clothing. Even storytelling sessions were strategically planned to keep groups of people together, in shared spaces during the coldest parts of the day. The architecture adaptations were brilliant examples of applied physics. They modified existing buildings to create smaller, more easily heated spaces within larger structures. They used textile barriers to create thermal zones, directing precious heat to specific areas where people were working or sleeping. They understood air circulation well enough to prevent carbon monoxide buildup while maintaining heat retention. Animal heat sharing was a crucial survival strategy that required careful planning and execution. Families would bring livestock into shared living spaces, not just to protect the animals, but because large animals like cows and horses generate substantial body heat. They developed protocols for managing the hygiene and ventilation challenges of shared human-animal living, while maximizing the thermal benefits. The timing strategies were sophisticated energy management systems. They planned physical activities during the coldest parts of the day to generate body heat when external warmth was least available. They scheduled communal meals during temperature drops to ensure people had calories available for heat generation when they needed it most. Hot food wasn't just nutrition during famine, it was a warming strategy. They developed cooking techniques that maximized the warming effect of meals, creating foods that provided internal heat that lasted for hours after eating. Hot soups and porridges weren't just easier to digest when people were weak. They provided essential internal warmth that helped maintain body temperature during fuel shortages. The psychological warming techniques were as important as the physical ones. They maintained communal activities that kept morale high and encouraged physical movement that generated heat. They created social gatherings that brought people together in shared spaces, providing both emotional warmth and literal shared body heat. But here's what really impresses me. They understood the medical aspects of cold stress and malnutrition interaction. They recognized that people who were already weakened by hunger were more susceptible to cold injury, and they developed specific protocols for protecting vulnerable community members from thermal stress. They created warming protocols for people showing signs of dangerous heat loss, specific techniques for gradually rewarming individuals without causing thermal shock. They understood which herbal remedies could improve circulation and heat generation, and which foods provided the most efficient calories for maintaining body temperature. The fuel gathering and management during famine required sophisticated planning. They identified alternative fuel sources beyond traditional firewood, dried animal dung, compressed plant materials, even rendered animal fats that could burn for heat. They developed techniques for processing these alternative fuels to maximize heat output and minimize smoke production. But they also understood fuel conservation at a systems level. They planned heating schedules that maximized shared warmth while minimizing total fuel consumption. They created heating rotations that ensured continuous warmth while allowing fuel supplies to be stretched across entire communities. The recovery planning was remarkable too. They maintained seed stocks for quick-growing plants that could provide future fuel sources. They preserved essential heating equipment and infrastructure, even during the most desperate phases of famine, understanding that surviving famine required maintaining the tools necessary for long-term survival. Modern emergency management experts, studying medieval cold survival techniques, consistently find sophisticated solutions that address complex thermodynamic challenges using minimal resources and community cooperation. These weren't desperate people making desperate choices, they were systematic problem solvers, creating sustainable solutions to life-threatening challenges. The lesson that resonates most deeply: they understood that surviving cold during famine required community cooperation and systematic planning. Individual families couldn't generate enough heat to survive alone, but communities working together could create thermal environments that kept everyone alive. Now we're getting to the secret sauce of medieval famine survival: information networks that would make modern social media algorithms jealous. When food disappeared, news about food became more valuable than gold, and peasants created communication systems that put medieval postal services to shame. Picture this. You're in a village where the grain stores ran out 2 months ago. Everyone's eating tree bark porridge, and you desperately need to know if the village 15 miles east has heard rumors about merchant caravans, successful harvests in neighboring regions, or new sources of edible plants. Now imagine doing this without phones, internet, or even reliable literacy. Welcome to medieval crisis communication. The system they developed was part neighborhood watch, part intelligence network, and part survival cooperative. Travelers weren't just people moving between locations, they were mobile information databases. carrying detailed knowledge about food availability, prices, safety conditions, and survival opportunities across vast geographical areas. But here's what's fascinating. The information wasn't just casually shared. Communities developed systematic protocols for gathering, verifying, and distributing survival-critical news. When a traveler arrived in a village, there were established procedures for debriefing them about conditions along their route, food sources they'd encountered, dangers they'd avoided, and opportunities they'd observed. Village leaders maintained what we might call intelligence networks with neighboring communities. They had regular messengers who traveled established routes, carrying news about local conditions, resource availability, and survival strategies. These weren't casual social visits. They were systematic information-gathering expeditions that kept communities informed about regional survival opportunities. The messenger system was remarkably sophisticated. Professional messengers during famine carried encoded information that protected sensitive details about food caches, successful foraging locations, and community resources from potential bandits or competitors. They used code systems that allowed them to communicate survival information securely while protecting vulnerable communities from exploitation. Women played crucial roles in these information networks, particularly in managing local communication systems. They maintained social connections that crossed village boundaries through marriage relationships, family connections, and trading partnerships. During famine, these social networks became vital communication channels for sharing survival information and coordinating mutual aid. The church networks provided another layer of information distribution. Priests and monks traveled between communities regularly, and during famine they carried detailed information about regional conditions, successful survival strategies, and community needs. Monasteries served as information clearinghouses where survival knowledge was collected, verified, and distributed to surrounding communities. Market day communications became intense information exchanges during famine years. Even when there wasn't much to trade, people gathered to share news about conditions in other areas, successful survival techniques, and opportunities for finding food or work. These gatherings served as regional information summits where survival knowledge was pooled and distributed. The accuracy of this informal intelligence network was remarkable. Communities developed verification protocols for checking information reliability, cross-referencing reports from multiple sources, and testing survival claims before committing resources. They understood that bad information during famine could be fatal, so they created systems for ensuring information quality. Children served as important messengers within these networks. Their ability to travel quickly, their social connections across family and community boundaries, and their detailed knowledge of local areas made them effective carriers of survival information. They could move between communities more easily than adults, and often had access to information that adults might miss. The speed of information travel was impressive considering the transportation limitations. Urgent survival information could travel hundreds of miles within days, passed through networks of reliable messengers who understood the life or death importance of accurate, timely communication. Success stories about new food sources or survival techniques could spread across entire regions within weeks. But the networks carried more than just food information. They distributed knowledge about disease outbreaks, weather predictions, security threats, and economic opportunities. Communities needed comprehensive situational awareness to make good survival decisions, and the information networks provided detailed intelligence about all factors affecting regional survival prospects. The social protocols around information sharing were complex and carefully managed. Communities had rules about which information could be shared freely, which required compensation or reciprocal information exchange, and which needed to be protected to prevent exploitation of vulnerable food sources or survival strategies. Trading information became a crucial economic activity during famine. Knowledge about successful foraging locations might be traded for access to preserved foods. News about merchant activities could be exchanged for survival tools or services. Information itself became a currency in the famine economy, with its own exchange rates and trading protocols. The psychological aspects of information networks were as important as the practical benefits. Regular communication with other communities provided emotional support and maintained hope during extended hardship. Knowing that other communities were surviving and finding solutions helped maintain morale and prevent despair during the darkest periods of famine. Recovery coordination relied heavily on these established communication networks. When conditions began to improve, communities could quickly share information about returning food availability, renewed trade opportunities, and recovery strategies. The networks that sustained survival during crisis became the foundation for coordinated regional recovery efforts. The preservation of information was also crucial. Communities maintained oral records of successful survival strategies, detailed knowledge about local food sources, and practical techniques that had proven effective during past famines. This knowledge was carefully preserved and transmitted through the information networks to ensure that survival expertise wasn't lost between crisis periods. Modern emergency communication experts studying medieval information networks consistently find sophisticated solutions for distributing critical information across large areas without modern technology. The redundancy, verification protocols, and systematic distribution methods they developed were remarkably effective for maintaining community awareness during crisis periods. But here's what really impresses me about these medieval communication systems. They understood that information was only valuable if it reached the people who needed it most. They developed protocols for ensuring that isolated communities, vulnerable families, and at-risk individuals received priority access to survival-critical information. The networks weren't just about sharing good news, they also distributed warnings about dangers, failures, and mistakes that other communities had made. This negative information was as valuable as positive news, because it helped communities avoid costly survival errors and learn from others' experiences without having to repeat dangerous experiments themselves. Here's where medieval famine survival gets really interesting from a psychological perspective. Communities didn't just share resources, they engineered social systems that kept people mentally and emotionally functional, while slowly starving. And honestly, modern community psychology has a lot to learn from medieval peasants about maintaining social cohesion under extreme stress. Let's start with something that would blow modern minds. Medieval communities understood that individual survival was impossible during extended famine, so they created social structures that made mutual dependence not just practical, but psychologically sustainable. They didn't just accept that they needed each other, they built cultural systems that made interdependence feel empowering rather than degrading. The sharing protocols during famine were sophisticated social engineering disguised as folk tradition. Communities didn't just divide available food equally, they created complex systems for resource distribution that maintained individual dignity while ensuring community survival. People contributed what they could and received what they needed, but the accounting systems preserved everyone's sense of personal worth and social contribution. Take the concept of famine partnerships, formal social agreements between families that created mutual support networks with clearly defined obligations and benefits. These weren't casual neighborly assistance arrangements, they were binding social contracts that ensured families had reliable support systems while maintaining their independence and self-respect. But here's what's really remarkable. They understood that maintaining normal social activities was crucial for psychological survival. So they adapted community traditions to work within famine limitations. Festivals continued, but focused on shared activities rather than food consumption. Religious celebrations maintained their social importance while adapting to resource constraints. The leadership structures during famine reveal sophisticated understanding of crisis psychology. Community leaders weren't just resource managers, they were morale officers, conflict mediators, and hope maintainers. They understood that keeping people psychologically functional was as important as keeping them physically alive. Village councils during famine made decisions through consensus processes that ensured everyone felt heard and valued, even when resources were desperately limited. They created systems for handling conflicts and disagreements that prevented social breakdown while maintaining community cohesion under extreme stress. The work-sharing arrangements were brilliant examples of applied psychology. Instead of having people compete for limited opportunities, communities created cooperative work systems that ensured everyone had meaningful contributions to make. People needed to feel useful and valued, not just fed and sheltered. Storytelling and cultural activities became crucial psychological survival tools. Communities maintained regular gatherings for sharing stories, songs, and cultural traditions that provided emotional comfort and reinforced social bonds. These weren't just entertainment, they were systematic psychological maintenance activities. The conflict resolution systems during famine were remarkably sophisticated. Communities understood that stress, hunger, and fear could destroy social relationships, So they developed protocols for managing disputes before they escalated into community-threatening conflicts. They created mediation systems that addressed problems while preserving social harmony. But let's talk about hope management, because this is where medieval psychology gets really advanced. Community leaders understood that maintaining realistic hope was essential for long-term survival, but false optimism could be dangerous. They developed communication strategies that acknowledged current difficulties while maintaining confidence in eventual recovery. The celebration of small victories was systematic and intentional. Communities created formal recognition for successful foraging expeditions, effective survival innovations, and acts of mutual support. They understood that maintaining positive social reinforcement was crucial for sustaining morale during extended hardship. Children's psychological welfare received special attention during famine. Adults worked hard to maintain children's sense of security and normalcy, creating modified versions of normal childhood activities that functioned within famine constraints. They understood that traumatizing children could damage long-term community recovery prospects. The integration of vulnerable community members was particularly sophisticated. Elderly people, disabled individuals, and others who couldn't contribute physical labor were given meaningful roles in community survival efforts. They served as knowledge keepers, child caretakers, food preparers, and cultural maintainers. Everyone had a role that maintained their dignity and social value. Religious and spiritual activities adapted to provide psychological support during famine, without becoming sources of additional stress. Communities modified religious observances to focus on mutual support, community cooperation, and hope maintenance rather than additional obligations that people couldn't fulfill during crisis periods. The mental health maintenance was intuitive, but effective. Communities recognized signs of depression, anxiety, and despair, and they had informal protocols for providing social support and intervention. People who were struggling psychologically received additional attention and support from community members who understood that mental health crises could threaten community survival. But here's what really impresses me. They maintained individual identity and personal dignity within communal survival systems. People didn't lose their sense of self or personal worth even when they were completely dependent on community support. The social systems preserved individual psychology while enabling collective survival. The communication patterns during famine were designed to maintain social bonds and prevent isolation. Communities ensured that everyone received regular social interaction, emotional support, and inclusion in community decision-making processes. No one was allowed to withdraw completely from social participation. The recovery preparation was psychologically sophisticated too. Communities began planning for post-famine social relationships before the famine ended, ensuring that the mutual dependence necessary for survival wouldn't create long-term social problems or resentments after normal conditions returned. Modern community psychology researchers studying medieval famine communities consistently find social systems that are more sophisticated than many contemporary approaches to crisis mental health. The integration of psychological support into daily survival activities, the systematic attention to maintaining individual dignity within collective survival efforts, and the proactive approach to preventing social breakdown are remarkably advanced. The gender dynamics during famine reveal nuanced understanding of social psychology. Women and men had different but equally valued roles in community survival, and the social systems preserved gender identity and relationships even under extreme circumstances. Marriages, family relationships, and social hierarchies adapted to crisis conditions without completely breaking down. But perhaps most impressively, these communities maintained their sense of humor. Famine records include jokes, playful activities, and social events that provided psychological relief and reinforced community bonds. They understood that laughter and play were essential for maintaining mental health during extended hardship. The lesson that resonates most powerfully. They understood that surviving famine required not just keeping people alive, but keeping people human. The social systems they created preserved dignity, maintained hope, and sustained the psychological foundations necessary for both individual survival and community recovery. Let's dive into the medieval equivalent of extreme couponing, making tiny amounts of food last impossibly long periods through preservation techniques that would make modern food scientists weep with professional envy. We're talking about people who could turn a handful of grain into months of sustenance through pure preservation wizardry. First, let's establish what we're working with. Medieval peasants during famine didn't have refrigeration, vacuum sealing, chemical preservatives, or controlled storage environments. What they had was centuries of accumulated knowledge about food chemistry, microbiology, though they didn't call it that, and storage engineering that turned preservation into a survival science. Salt preservation, during famine, became an exercise in resource optimization that bordered on alchemy. When salt was scarce and expensive, they developed techniques for maximizing preservation effectiveness while minimizing salt usage. They understood salt gradients, moisture control, and curing chemistry well enough to preserve foods using minimal salt while achieving maximum storage life. The technique involved creating salt mixtures with herbs and other preservation agents that enhanced salt effectiveness. They knew which plants had natural antimicrobial properties that could extend preservation when combined with limited salt supplies. Juniper berries, certain tree barks, and specific wild herbs could enhance salt preservation while adding their own preservation chemistry. Smoking preservation reached levels of sophistication that modern barbecue enthusiasts would envy. They didn't just hang food over fires and hope for the best. They understood wood chemistry, controlled temperature environments, and timing protocols that created preserved foods with extended storage life and improved nutritional retention. Different woods provided different preservation properties. Oak produced smoke with specific antimicrobial compounds. Apple and cherry woods added preservation chemistry while improving flavor. They could combine woods to create custom preservation environments optimized for different types of foods and storage requirements. But here's where it gets impressive. They understood moisture management at a level that required intuitive understanding of water activity and bacterial growth. They could create storage environments that maintained optimal humidity levels for preventing spoilage, while avoiding excessive drying that would destroy nutritional content. The container technology was remarkably advanced. They created storage vessels using clay, wood, and textile materials that provided controlled environments for different types of preservation. They understood which materials were naturally antimicrobial, which provided optimal moisture control, and which could be sealed effectively to prevent contamination. Fermentation preservation during famine was applied chemistry disguised as folk knowledge. They could ferment virtually any organic material that contained fermentable sugars, creating preserved foods that were not only shelf-stable, but actually more nutritious than the original ingredients due to the fermentation process. Sauerkraut production used wild cabbage and other available vegetables, but the fermentation techniques could be applied to almost any plant material. They understood fermentation timing, salt ratios, temperature control, and environmental management that produced consistent, safe, nutritious preserved foods, even when working with marginal ingredients. The root cellars and storage structures they built were sophisticated environmental control systems. They understood soil temperature stability, air circulation requirements, moisture management, and insulation techniques that created storage environments that could preserve foods for months without spoilage. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were engineered storage systems that maintained optimal temperature and humidity conditions for different types of foods. Root vegetables required different storage conditions than preserved meats, and they could create multi-zone storage systems within single structures. Fat preservation was crucial during famine, because fats provided concentrated calories and could be used as preservation media for other foods. They understood rendering techniques that maximized fat extraction, while creating preservation media that could store other foods safely for extended periods. Rendered animal fats could preserve vegetables, meats, and even some dairy products by creating anaerobic environments that prevented spoilage. They knew which fats provided the best preservation properties, and how to combine fat preservation with other techniques for maximum effectiveness. The timing and seasonal storage planning was remarkably sophisticated. They understood exactly when different foods needed to be harvested and preserved to maximize storage life and nutritional retention. They could predict how long different preserved foods would remain safe and nutritious, allowing them to plan consumption schedules that optimized resource utilization. But here's what really impresses me. They understood nutritional degradation over time and planned their preservation techniques to minimize vitamin and mineral losses during storage. They knew which preservation methods retained the most nutrition and how to combine different preserved foods to maintain balanced nutrition over extended periods. Drying techniques went far beyond simple air drying. They understood controlled dehydration using heat, air circulation, and environmental management that removed moisture while preserving maximum nutritional content. They could create dried foods with extended storage life that retained much of their original nutritional value. The reconstitution knowledge was equally advanced. They knew how to restore dried and preserved foods to palatable, nutritious meals. They understood which preserved foods needed soaking, which required specific cooking techniques, and how to combine different preserved ingredients to create satisfying meals. Quality control during preservation was systematic and reliable. They could identify signs of spoilage, contamination, and preservation failure early enough to salvage foods or prevent dangerous consumption. They had protocols for testing preserved foods and determining safety before consumption. The innovation during famine was remarkable. When traditional preservation methods weren't possible due to resource limitations, they developed alternative techniques using available materials. They could adapt preservation methods to work with whatever containers, preservation agents, and environmental conditions were available. Modern food preservation experts studying medieval techniques consistently find sophisticated solutions that achieve remarkable preservation effectiveness using minimal resources and simple technologies. The understanding of food chemistry, microbiology, and environmental control demonstrated in these preservation systems is remarkably advanced. But perhaps most impressively, they maintained food safety standards even during desperate circumstances. They understood that eating spoiled, preserved foods could be worse than eating no food at all, and they maintained quality control protocols that prevented food poisoning even when people were desperately hungry. The psychological aspects of preservation were important too. Having stores of preserved food provided emotional security and hope during famine. The act of preserving food, even in small amounts, gave people a sense of control and future planning that helped maintain morale during extended hardship. The recovery planning through preservation was sophisticated. They preserved seed stocks, breeding animals, and essential resources that would be needed for recovery after famine ended. They understood that surviving famine required not just immediate survival, but maintaining the foundation for future food production. Welcome to the most desperate job market in human history, finding ways to earn food, shelter, or trade goods when the entire agricultural economy has collapsed and everyone else is also desperately seeking work. Medieval peasants during famine created alternative economies that would make modern freelancers look like amateurs. Let's start with the obvious problem. When crops fail, agricultural labor disappears. When food becomes scarce, traditional trade relationships break down. When communities are struggling to survive, luxury services become irrelevant. So what do you do when your primary economic activity becomes impossible and everyone around you faces the same problem? Medieval peasants got creative in ways that reveal remarkable economic sophistication. They didn't just look for existing jobs. They created entirely new economic activities based on famine conditions and survival needs. They identified unmet needs in survival economies and developed services that provided value even when traditional economic activities were impossible. Foraging guides became professional occupations during famine. People with superior knowledge of local plant identification, seasonal availability, and food preparation could earn compensation by teaching others or leading group foraging expeditions. This wasn't just sharing knowledge, it was systematic education services that provided real economic value. The compensation might be food sharing from successful foraging trips, priority access to preserved foods, or future labor commitments. Skilled foragers could negotiate service agreements that provided ongoing support in exchange for continuing education and guidance in survival techniques. Preservation specialists developed consulting services for families and communities that needed help maximizing their limited resources. People who understood smoking, salting, fermentation, and storage could earn compensation by helping others preserve foods more effectively. They provided technical services that directly improved survival outcomes. Tool maintenance and repair became crucial economic activities when new tools weren't available and existing tools needed to last indefinitely. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and other craftspeople adapted their skills to focus on repair, modification, and maintenance services that kept essential survival tools functional. But the payment systems had to adapt to famine conditions. Instead of monetary compensation, skilled craftspeople might receive food, fuel, clothing, or future labor commitments. They developed complex barter arrangements that allowed them to continue providing valuable services while receiving compensation that met their survival needs. Medical and healing services became increasingly valuable during famine, as malnutrition and stress created health problems that required attention. People with knowledge of herbal medicine, basic healthcare, and injury treatment could provide essential services that communities desperately needed. The compensation for medical services often involved food sharing, priority access to resources, or community protection arrangements. Healers might receive guaranteed food allocations in exchange for providing healthcare services to entire communities during famine periods. Storytelling and entertainment services provided psychological value that communities were willing to support even during resource scarcity. Professional storytellers, musicians, and entertainers could earn food and shelter by providing morale-boosting services that helped maintain community mental health during extended hardship. But here's where medieval gig economy gets really interesting. Information brokerage became a legitimate profession. People who traveled between communities could earn compensation for carrying news, messages, and intelligence about survival opportunities, resource availability, and regional conditions. These information brokers developed sophisticated service offerings that provided real value to communities that needed accurate, timely information for making survival decisions. They could earn food, shelter, and protection by providing reliable intelligence services to communities that couldn't afford to send their own messengers. Transportation and courier services adapted to famine conditions by focusing on survival-critical cargo rather than luxury goods. People with access to animals, carts, or boats could earn compensation by transporting essential resources, messages, or people between communities that needed connection during crisis periods. The risk management for these services was sophisticated. Couriers and transporters developed protocols for protecting cargo, ensuring delivery reliability, and managing the increased dangers of travel during famine periods. They created service agreements that balanced risk with compensation in ways that made transportation services economically viable. Security services became increasingly important, as famine created conditions that increased banditry, theft, and community conflicts. People with military experience or fighting skills could earn compensation by providing protection services for individuals, families, or entire communities during vulnerable periods. But the security services had to adapt to famine economics. Instead of monetary payment, security providers might receive food allocations, housing, or community membership benefits. They developed service models that provided ongoing protection in exchange for ongoing support from the communities they protected. Teaching and education services focused on survival skills rather than traditional academic subjects. People with specialized knowledge about agriculture, crafts, food preparation, or other practical skills could earn compensation by providing education services that improved community survival capabilities. The educational services often involved long-term arrangements where teachers received ongoing support in exchange for systematic skill transfer that improved overall community capabilities. These weren't just casual knowledge sharing, they were formal education programs that provided measurable value to survival-focused communities. Religious and spiritual services adapted to provide comfort and guidance during crisis periods. Clergy and spiritual leaders could earn support by providing psychological services, ritual comfort, and moral guidance that helped communities maintain social cohesion during extended hardship. But perhaps most importantly, coordination and management services became valuable as communities needed help organizing complex survival activities. People with organizational skills could earn compensation by managing resource distribution, coordinating work activities, and facilitating community decision-making processes. These management services required sophisticated understanding of group psychology, resource optimization, and conflict resolution. Community managers could earn ongoing support by providing organizational services that improved overall community survival effectiveness. The innovation in service development was remarkable. People identified unmet needs in famine economies and developed creative service offerings that provided real value while earning compensation that met their survival requirements. They created entirely new economic activities that didn't exist during normal periods. Modern gig economy researchers studying medieval famine employment patterns consistently find sophisticated service models that adapted traditional skills to crisis conditions, while creating entirely new economic opportunities based on changing community needs. But here's what really impresses me about the medieval famine gig economy. People maintained professional standards and service quality even under extreme circumstances. They understood that providing reliable, high-quality services was essential for building the trust and reputation necessary for sustained economic relationships during crisis periods. The lesson that resonates most deeply: economic adaptation during crisis requires creativity, flexibility, and a deep understanding of changing community needs. People who could identify unmet needs and develop valuable services could create economic opportunities even under the most challenging circumstances. Now we're entering the most heartbreaking and simultaneously inspiring aspect of medieval famine survival, trying to keep people healthy when there's barely enough food to keep them alive. Medieval healthcare during famine was like performing surgery with kitchen knives, while the hospital is on fire, and somehow they made it work. Let's start with the fundamental challenge. Malnutrition creates a cascade of health problems that are difficult to treat even with modern medicine, and medieval healers had to address these problems using local resources, while they themselves were also malnourished. They needed to provide healthcare when the primary medicine, adequate nutrition, wasn't available. The medical understanding of malnutrition was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. Medieval healers recognized different types of nutritional deficiency and understood that different health problems resulted from lacking specific types of food. They knew that certain symptoms indicated protein deficiency, others suggested vitamin deficiencies, and still others revealed mineral shortages. But more importantly, they developed treatment protocols that worked within famine limitations. Instead of trying to cure malnutrition with adequate food, which wasn't available, they focused on managing symptoms and preventing the most dangerous complications using whatever resources were accessible. Herbal medicine during famine required remarkable botanical knowledge and creative adaptation. Healers needed to know which local plants provided specific medicinal properties, how to prepare them effectively, and how to combine them to address complex health problems. They couldn't rely on imported medicines or cultivated herbs. Everything had to be foraged, identified, and prepared using local resources. The plant identification skills were literally life or death knowledge. Healers needed to distinguish between medicinal plants and poisonous lookalikes. While foraging in areas where they might not be completely familiar with local flora, they developed verification protocols and safety procedures that prevented accidental poisoning while gathering essential medicines. But here's where medieval medicine gets really impressive. They understood the interaction between psychological and physical health in ways that modern medicine is just rediscovering. They recognized that despair and hopelessness could accelerate physical decline, and they developed treatment approaches that addressed both mental and physical symptoms simultaneously. The community healthcare systems during famine were sophisticated examples of public health management. Villagers developed protocols for identifying and isolating contagious diseases, managing healthcare resources across entire communities, and providing care for vulnerable populations who couldn't care for themselves. Preventive medicine became crucial. When treatment resources were limited, healers focused on preventing diseases and complications rather than just treating them after they occurred. They developed community health protocols that reduced disease transmission, prevented common injuries, and maintained basic sanitation even when resources were scarce. The diagnostic skills were remarkable, considering the limitations. Medieval healers could identify complex health conditions using observation, basic physical examination, and detailed patient history. They understood symptom patterns that indicated specific problems and could distinguish between different conditions that might have similar presentations. Pain management during famine required creative use of available resources. Healers knew which local plants provided analgesic properties, how to prepare them effectively, and how to combine them for maximum pain relief. They developed techniques for managing chronic pain and acute injuries using only foraged medicines and basic treatments. But the psychological support was as important as physical treatment. Medieval healers understood that maintaining hope and providing emotional comfort were essential parts of medical treatment, especially when physical remedies were limited. They provided counseling, spiritual support, and psychological care as integral parts of their medical practice. Childbirth and infant care during famine presented extraordinary challenges that required specialized knowledge and community support. Midwives needed to manage pregnancies and deliveries when mothers were malnourished. Resources were scarce, and infant mortality risks were elevated. They developed protocols for supporting maternal health and infant survival under extremely difficult conditions. The nutrition optimization for medical treatment was sophisticated chemistry disguised as folk medicine. Healers understood which foods provided specific nutrients needed for healing, how to prepare foods to maximize nutritional absorption, and how to combine limited ingredients to create medically therapeutic meals. Wound care and injury treatment required creativity and resourcefulness when medical supplies weren't available. Healers knew how to create antiseptic solutions from local plants, how to prepare wound dressings from available materials, and how to manage infections using herbal medicines and basic surgical techniques. The surgical knowledge was remarkable, considering the limitations. Medieval healers could perform basic surgical procedures using improvised instruments and local anesthetics. They understood wound management, infection prevention, and post-surgical care using only resources they could forage or prepare locally. But perhaps most impressively, they developed triage protocols for allocating limited medical resources across entire communities. They understood how to prioritize medical care to achieve maximum community survival benefit when they couldn't provide optimal care for everyone who needed treatment. Elderly care during famine required balancing limited resources with community values about respecting and supporting older community members. Healers developed protocols for maintaining elderly health and comfort while working within resource constraints that made optimal elder care impossible. The dental and oral health management was important for maintaining people's ability to eat the limited and often difficult foods available during famine. Healers knew techniques for managing dental pain, preventing oral infections, and maintaining oral health using local plants and basic treatments. Mental health treatment during famine was integrated into community social support systems rather than treated as separate medical care. Healers understood that individual psychological problems often reflected community-wide stress, and they developed treatment approaches that addressed both individual symptoms and community mental health needs. Disease outbreak management during famine required sophisticated understanding of epidemiology and public health. Healers could identify emerging disease problems, implement isolation protocols, and manage community-wide prevention measures that prevented small health problems from becoming community-threatening epidemics. Modern medical anthropologists studying medieval famine healthcare consistently find sophisticated treatment protocols that achieved remarkable outcomes using minimal resources, and community-based care systems. The integration of physical, psychological, and social health treatment approaches demonstrates advanced understanding of holistic healthcare. But here's what really impresses me about medieval famine medicine. Healers maintained professional ethical standards, even when resources were desperately limited. They provided care based on medical need rather than ability to pay, maintained patient confidentiality, and continued providing services even when they themselves were suffering from malnutrition and hardship. The lesson that resonates most powerfully: effective healthcare during crisis requires not just medical knowledge, but community cooperation, creative resourcefulness, and a deep understanding that physical health, mental health, and social health are interconnected aspects of overall human well-being. Here's where we need to talk about the real MVPs of medieval famine survival: the women who turned household management into survival science and created innovations that kept entire communities alive. While history books focus on kings and wars, medieval women were quietly revolutionizing everything from food technology to social organization during humanity's darkest periods. Let's start with something that modern nutrition science is just catching up to. Medieval women understood food combining and nutritional optimization at a level that would impress contemporary dietitians. They didn't just know which plants were edible, they understood which combinations of foods created complete nutrition profiles and how to maximize nutritional value from minimal ingredients. Women developed what we'd now call survival cuisine, systematic approaches to creating nutritious, palatable meals from ingredients that individually would be barely edible. They understood protein complementation, knew which plant combinations created complete amino acid profiles, and could design meal plans that prevented specific nutritional deficiency diseases, even when working with severely limited ingredients. The textile innovations during famine were remarkable examples of applied engineering disguised as domestic skills. Women could disassemble and reassemble clothing to create superior insulation, develop new weaving techniques using unconventional materials, and create textile solutions for problems that ranged from food storage to weather protection. They invented new fabric treatments using local plants and minerals that improved water resistance, insect protection, and durability. They developed textile recycling techniques that could turn worn-out clothing into useful household items, insulation materials, and even emergency medical supplies. But here's where women's innovation gets really impressive. They created social technologies that were as important as any physical invention. Women developed communication networks that carried survival information across vast distances, created childcare cooperatives that ensured community children received adequate attention even when parents were struggling, and established resource-sharing systems that distributed survival necessities more effectively than formal economic systems. The seed preservation and plant breeding knowledge that women maintained was crucial for community recovery after famine ended. They understood which plant varieties were most resilient, how to maintain genetic diversity in seed stocks, and how to adapt cultivation techniques to changing environmental conditions. This wasn't casual gardening, it was sophisticated agricultural science that ensured communities could recover food production capabilities once conditions improved. Women's medical knowledge during famine was particularly advanced because they combined formal herbal medicine training with practical experience, managing family health under resource constraints. They understood drug interactions, dosage calculations, and treatment protocols that required adapting standard medical practices to work with limited resources and compromised patient health. The psychological support systems that women created were essential for maintaining community mental health during extended hardship. They developed formal and informal counseling networks, created support groups for different types of stress and trauma, and established social activities that provided emotional relief and community bonding during periods when normal social life was disrupted. But let's talk about the innovation in food preservation and processing that women developed during famine. They created fermentation techniques using unconventional ingredients, developed smoking and drying methods that worked with limited fuel, and invented storage solutions that extended food safety and nutritional retention using only locally available materials. The creativity was remarkable. When traditional preservation methods weren't possible, women developed alternative techniques that achieved similar results using whatever resources were available. They could adapt preservation chemistry to work with different ingredients, environmental conditions, and equipment limitations. Child development strategies during famine reveal sophisticated understanding of developmental psychology and educational theory. Women created learning environments that maintained children's intellectual and emotional development, even when resources were scarce and survival pressures were intense. They adapted traditional educational activities to work within famine constraints, while ensuring that children continued learning essential life skills. The work organization systems that women developed maximized efficiency while maintaining social relationships that were crucial for community survival. They created cooperative work arrangements that allowed families to accomplish necessary tasks, while providing mutual support and shared childcare that enabled everyone to contribute to community survival efforts. Women's economic innovations during famine created entirely new systems for managing resources and labor. When traditional economic relationships broke down, they developed barter networks, established credit systems based on future labor, and created cooperative ownership arrangements that allowed communities to share resources effectively while maintaining individual family autonomy. The conflict resolution skills that women brought to community management were essential for preventing social breakdown during periods of extreme stress. They developed mediation techniques that addressed disputes while preserving social relationships, created protocols for managing resource conflicts, and established systems for maintaining community cooperation even when competition for survival resources created tensions. But perhaps most importantly, women maintained cultural continuity during crisis periods. They ensured that traditional knowledge, social customs, and community values weren't lost during periods when survival pressures threatened to destroy normal social life. They adapted cultural activities to work within famine constraints, while preserving the cultural foundation necessary for community recovery. The innovation in household management was sophisticated systems engineering that optimized resource utilization. While maintaining family functionality, women could manage complex resource allocation decisions, coordinate multiple survival activities simultaneously, and maintain household operations that supported both immediate survival needs and long-term recovery planning. Modern researchers studying medieval women's survival innovations consistently find sophisticated solutions that demonstrate advanced understanding of nutrition science, textile engineering, social psychology, and community organization. The innovations they developed often proved superior to contemporary solutions developed by formal institutions with greater resources. The teaching and knowledge transfer systems that women created were essential for ensuring that survival innovations weren't lost and could be adapted to different communities and circumstances. They developed systematic approaches to education that transferred both practical skills and theoretical understanding in ways that prepared communities for future challenges. But here's what really impresses me about women's contributions to medieval famine survival. They maintained compassion, and human dignity while developing practical solutions to life-threatening problems. Their innovations weren't just about keeping people alive, they were about preserving what made life worth living even under impossible circumstances. The lesson that resonates most deeply: the most important survival innovations often came from people who understood that surviving crisis required not just solving immediate problems, but maintaining the social, cultural, and psychological foundations necessary for both individual resilience and community recovery. Women's contributions to medieval famine survival demonstrate that true survival expertise requires both technical knowledge and deep understanding of human nature. Now we're getting to the part that keeps historians awake at night: how medieval famine didn't just kill people. It fundamentally rewrote the social, economic, and political foundations of European civilization. These weren't just temporary emergencies that communities recovered from. They were transformative events that changed everything about how human societies organized themselves. Let's start with something that sounds almost impossible. Famine actually accelerated social mobility in ways that would make modern sociologists jealous. When traditional economic structures collapsed, survival skills became more valuable than inherited social status. Peasants who understood food preservation could become community leaders. Women with medical knowledge gained political influence. Children who mastered foraging techniques earned respect that transcended normal age hierarchies. The labor shortages created by famine mortality broke down feudal labor systems that had been considered permanent and unchangeable. When significant portions of the population died or migrated seeking food, surviving workers could negotiate better working conditions, higher compensation, and greater personal freedom. Famine created the first widespread labor market dynamics that gave common people economic leverage over landowners. But here's where it gets really interesting. Communities that survived famine developed institutional knowledge and social systems that made them more resilient to future crises. They created permanent food storage systems, established early warning networks for detecting emerging food shortages, and maintained survival skill education programs that prepared them for future emergencies. These changes weren't temporary adaptations that disappeared once normal conditions returned. They became permanent features of community organization that provided ongoing benefits for economic stability, social cooperation, and crisis management. Communities that experienced severe famine often became more prosperous and stable in the long term because they developed superior social technologies. The agricultural innovations forced by famine led to permanent improvements in food production efficiency and crop resilience. Farmers learned to diversify crops to prevent total harvest failure, developed irrigation and soil management techniques that improved yields, and created seed selection programs that produced more resilient plant varieties. But the changes went beyond just technical improvements. Famine forced communities to think systematically about food security in ways that led to permanent changes in land use, agricultural planning, and resource management. They developed regional cooperation systems that pooled agricultural risk across multiple communities. The economic innovations created during famine became permanent features of medieval commerce. The barter systems, credit arrangements, and resource-sharing networks that developed during crisis periods evolved into more sophisticated trading relationships that continued long after famine conditions ended. Communities that had learned to operate complex survival economies during famine found that the organizational skills and cooperative relationships they developed were valuable for normal economic activities too. They could organize large-scale projects, coordinate resource allocation across multiple communities, and manage complex trading relationships more effectively than communities that hadn't experienced crisis cooperation. The social changes were equally profound. Famine broke down rigid social hierarchies and created more fluid social systems that recognized multiple types of valuable contribution. Communities that had learned to value survival skills, cooperative behavior, and mutual support developed social systems that were more egalitarian and more resilient to total stress. Women's roles in society changed permanently in communities that recognized women's crucial contributions to famine survival. The medical knowledge, resource management skills, and social organization abilities that women had demonstrated during crisis periods earned them ongoing social influence and economic opportunities that continued after emergency conditions ended. But perhaps most importantly, famine changed political relationships between communities and governing authorities. Communities that had learned to organize effective survival responses during famine were less dependent on external authority and more capable of self-governance. They developed political systems that balanced individual autonomy with community cooperation in ways that made them more resistant to political exploitation. The technological innovations forced by famine had ripple effects that extended far beyond food production and survival needs. Communities that had learned to innovate rapidly under extreme constraints developed cultures of innovation that continued generating technological improvements long after crisis periods ended. The preservation techniques, tool modifications, and resource optimization methods developed during famine became standard practices that improved overall quality of life, even when food was abundant. Communities maintained the advanced skills they'd learned during emergencies and continued applying them to normal life challenges. The educational systems changed permanently in communities that had recognized the life or death importance of practical knowledge and survival skills. They developed education programs that combined traditional academic learning with practical skills training, creating more comprehensive and useful educational systems. Children who had learned advanced survival skills during famine became adults with superior problem-solving abilities, practical knowledge, and collaborative skills that served them throughout their lives. Communities that had invested in comprehensive survival education produced generations of citizens who were more capable, more resilient, and more innovative. The religious and cultural changes were equally significant. Communities that had experienced extreme hardship together developed stronger social bonds, more sophisticated mutual support systems, and cultural traditions that emphasized community cooperation and collective resilience. But famine also created cultural knowledge about crisis management, social cooperation, and resource optimization that was passed down through generations as folk wisdom and cultural tradition. This knowledge prepared communities for future challenges and created cultural foundations for resilience that benefited them in ways that extended far beyond food security. The demographic changes created by famine mortality had long-term economic and social effects that reshaped entire regions. Labor shortages led to wage increases, social mobility, and political changes that redistributed wealth and power in ways that created more equitable societies. But the psychological changes may have been the most important of all. Communities that had successfully survived extreme challenges together developed collective confidence, cooperative habits, and problem-solving capabilities that served them in all aspects of life. They learned that they could overcome seemingly impossible challenges through intelligence, cooperation, and determination. Modern historians studying the long-term effects of medieval famine consistently find that communities that experienced severe famine often became more prosperous, more stable, and more innovative in the generations that followed. The crisis experience created social capital, institutional knowledge, and cultural capabilities that provided ongoing benefits for centuries. The lesson that emerges from studying these long-term effects is both sobering and hopeful. Extreme challenges can destroy communities, but they can also transform them in ways that make them stronger, more capable, and more resilient than they were before the crisis began. Here's where this story gets uncomfortably relevant to modern life. Medieval peasants facing famine developed survival strategies, social technologies, and community resilience systems that put our contemporary crisis management to shame. While we panic buy toilet paper during minor supply disruptions, medieval communities created systematic solutions for surviving actual civilizational collapse. Let's start with something that should make every modern prepper feel embarrassed. Medieval communities maintained comprehensive disaster preparedness as a normal part of daily life. They didn't wait for emergencies to start thinking about survival. They lived with constant awareness of potential crisis and built their normal social and economic systems around resilience rather than efficiency. Modern supply chains are optimized for cost reduction and just-in-time delivery, creating systems that are incredibly efficient during normal conditions, but catastrophically vulnerable to any disruption. Medieval communities built redundancy, local production capability, and crisis adaptation into their normal economic activities, creating systems that were less efficient but far more resilient. The food security strategies that medieval communities maintained would solve most modern food insecurity problems. They understood seasonal planning, preservation techniques, and diversified nutrition in ways that created food systems capable of sustaining communities through extended periods of disruption. They planned for scarcity during abundance, and maintained food security as a community responsibility rather than an individual problem. But here's where medieval social technology gets really relevant. They understood that individual survival was impossible during crisis. So they built social systems that made mutual dependence functional and sustainable rather than degrading. Modern individualistic culture assumes that self-reliance is superior to interdependence. But medieval communities proved that systematic cooperation could provide greater security and higher quality of life than individual preparation. The community organization systems they developed could address most contemporary social problems. They created resource-sharing networks that ensured essential needs were met for all community members, established conflict resolution systems that maintained social cooperation under stress, and developed leadership structures that balanced individual autonomy with collective decision-making. Modern mental health crises could benefit from medieval approaches to community psychological support. They understood that individual mental health was connected to community health, and they created social systems that provided ongoing emotional support, meaningful work, and social connection as normal features of community life, rather than specialized services that people access during crisis. The education systems they developed during famine teach important lessons about practical knowledge and adaptive learning. They combined theoretical knowledge with practical skills, emphasized collaborative problem-solving over competitive achievement, and created learning systems that prepared people for unpredictable challenges rather than specific predetermined careers. Modern educational systems that focus on standardized testing and specialized knowledge could learn from medieval approaches to comprehensive practical education that prepared people to adapt to changing circumstances and contribute to community welfare under various conditions. The economic innovations they created during famine offer alternatives to contemporary economic systems that create vulnerability and inequality. They developed local currency systems, cooperative ownership arrangements, and resource distribution networks that prioritized community stability and individual security over profit maximization and economic growth. But perhaps most importantly, they understood that economic systems needed to serve human welfare rather than abstract financial goals. They created economic relationships that maintained human dignity, supported community cooperation, and provided security for vulnerable populations as primary objectives rather than secondary considerations. The healthcare approaches they developed integrated physical health, mental health, and social health in ways that modern medical systems are just beginning to understand. They treated health as a community responsibility, emphasized prevention over treatment, and created healthcare systems that act within resource limitations while maintaining care quality. Modern healthcare systems that focus on high-technology treatment of individual patients could learn from medieval approaches to community health management, preventive care, and health systems that remain functional during resource constraints and crisis conditions. The environmental sustainability practices that medieval communities maintained out of necessity offer solutions for modern environmental challenges. They lived within ecological limits, developed renewable resource management systems, and created production methods that enhanced rather than depleted natural systems. They understood that human communities needed to work with natural systems rather than against them, and they developed lifestyle practices that provided high quality of life while maintaining ecological sustainability over extended periods. The innovation strategies they developed during crisis could address modern challenges that require rapid adaptation and creative problem-solving. They created innovation systems that combined traditional knowledge with experimental adaptation, encouraged broad participation in problem-solving, and developed solutions that worked with available resources rather than requiring optimal conditions. Modern innovation systems that depend on specialized expertise and high-technology solutions could learn from medieval approaches to distributed innovation that engaged entire communities in identifying problems and developing solutions using available resources and local knowledge. But here's what might be most important for modern society. They maintained hope, dignity, and cultural continuity during periods of extreme hardship. They didn't just survive crisis, they found ways to preserve what made life meaningful and worth living even under impossible circumstances. Modern societies facing climate change, economic instability, and social disruption could learn from medieval approaches to maintaining community resilience, cultural strength, and psychological stability during periods of extended challenge and uncertainty. The social capital they created through crisis cooperation provided ongoing benefits that made communities stronger and more capable long after crisis conditions ended. They understood that surviving challenge required not just solving immediate problems, but building social foundations that could support ongoing prosperity and resilience. Modern communities struggling with social isolation, political polarization, and institutional breakdown could learn from medieval approaches to building social cooperation, managing conflict, and creating community systems that serve human welfare under various conditions. But perhaps the most important lesson is about human capability and resilience. Medieval peasants facing famine proved that ordinary people could develop extraordinary capabilities when they understood that their survival and prosperity depended on community cooperation and mutual support. Modern societies that assume most people are incapable of significant contribution could learn from medieval examples of communities that recognized and developed the capabilities of all their members, creating social systems that maximized human potential rather than accepting human limitations as unchangeable. The lesson that resonates most powerfully across the centuries is that human communities are capable of remarkable adaptation, innovation, and resilience when they understand that their individual welfare depends on collective capability, and when they create social systems that support both individual dignity and community cooperation. Let's talk about the numbers that medieval people lived and died by, because the mathematics of famine survival reveal just how close entire communities came to extinction, and how precisely they calculated their way back from the brink. These weren't just people hoping for the best, they were running complex survival equations in their heads while slowly starving. First, let's establish the baseline mathematics of medieval nutrition during normal times versus famine conditions. A typical peasant required approximately 2,000–2,500 calories per day for sustainable health. But during severe famine, communities learned to function on 800–1,200 calories per person per day for extended periods. That's not just being hungry, that's operating at 40–50% of normal caloric intake while maintaining physical labor and community activities. The caloric mathematics of emergency foods reveal the precision required for survival planning. Acorn flour provided approximately 30–87 calories per 100 grams, but required extensive processing that consumed energy and time. Tree bark flour provided roughly 250 calories per 100 grams, but was more readily available. Communities needed to calculate not just caloric content, but processing energy costs, availability timing, and nutritional completeness when planning emergency food strategies. But here's where the mathematics get really impressive. Communities developed sophisticated rationing calculations that balanced individual nutritional needs against community resource constraints. They understood that different community members required different caloric allocations based on age, health status, physical activity, and social role. A blacksmith might receive 1,400 calories per day, while children received 900 calories, but pregnant women might receive 1,200 calories despite doing less physical labor. The preservation mathematics were equally complex. Communities needed to calculate optimal resource allocation between immediate consumption and preservation for future needs. Preserving food required initial resource investment, salt, fuel, labor, that reduced immediate food availability but potentially prevented starvation months later. They developed calculation systems for determining optimal preservation ratios based on current food availability, preservation resource costs, and projected famine duration. Storage calculations required understanding deterioration rates, seasonal availability patterns, and risk management probabilities. A community might calculate that storing 60% of autumn nut harvest would provide essential calories during late winter, but they needed to account for storage losses, pest damage, and the possibility that preserved foods might spoil before they were needed. The labor mathematics during famine reveal sophisticated resource optimization calculations. Foraging expeditions required energy expenditure that needed to produce caloric returns, exceeding energy investment. A foraging trip that required 300 calories of energy expenditure needed to produce more than 300 calories of food to be worthwhile. But communities also calculated opportunity costs of labor allocation between different survival activities. Work allocation calculations balanced immediate survival needs against long-term community sustainability. Communities needed to maintain essential activities like food preservation, tool maintenance, and healthcare while maximizing resource gathering activities. They developed labor allocation formulas that ensured critical community functions continued while optimizing survival resource production. The sharing mathematics were remarkably sophisticated for managing resource distribution across communities with different family sizes, capabilities, and needs. Communities couldn't simply divide available food equally. They needed distribution systems that accounted for individual nutritional requirements, contribution capabilities, and long-term community sustainability. Some communities developed point systems for tracking individual contributions and resource allocation that balanced fairness with practical survival needs. A family might contribute foraging labor, preservation expertise, and childcare services, while receiving food allocations, fuel access, and medical care, according to complex calculation systems that ensured equitable resource distribution. But let's examine the mortality mathematics, because understanding death rates during famine reveals both the severity of crisis and the effectiveness of community survival strategies. During severe famines like the Great Famine of 1315-1313-22, mortality rates increased by 10 to 25% above normal levels, but communities that implemented systematic survival strategies often limited mortality increases to 5. The demographic calculations show that famine mortality wasn't evenly distributed across communities. Children under 5 and adults over 60 experienced the highest mortality rates, but communities that prioritized resource allocation to vulnerable populations could significantly reduce mortality in these high-risk groups through systematic resource allocation and specialized care. Survival probability calculations based on community cooperation versus individual survival attempts reveal dramatic differences in outcomes. Isolated families during famine experienced mortality rates 2 to 3 times higher than families participating in community survival networks, demonstrating the mathematical advantage of cooperative survival strategies. The economic mathematics of famine recovery show how communities calculated resource allocation for both immediate survival and future recovery capability. Communities needed to maintain seed stocks for future planting, preserve breeding animals for livestock recovery, and maintain tool and infrastructure maintenance even while using maximum resources for immediate survival. Recovery calculations required understanding the minimum resource investment necessary to restore food production capability once famine conditions ended. Communities that allocated 10–15% of available resources to recovery preparation during famine typically restored normal food production 50% faster than communities that focused exclusively on immediate survival. The geographic mathematics of resource access reveal how communities calculated optimal foraging territories, trade relationships, and resource-sharing arrangements with neighboring areas. Effective foraging required understanding seasonal availability patterns across different ecological zones within accessible distances. Communities developed mathematical models for calculating travel costs versus resource-gathering benefits that optimized foraging efficiency while minimizing energy expenditure. These calculations considered seasonal changes, competition from other communities, and environmental factors that affected resource availability and accessibility. But perhaps most impressively, medieval communities developed risk assessment mathematics that balanced probable outcomes against resource allocation decisions. They calculated probability estimates for different famine duration scenarios and allocated resources based on multiple possible outcomes rather than single best case or worst case assumptions. The insurance mathematics they developed through community cooperation created risk-sharing systems that reduced individual family survival uncertainty while improving overall community survival probability. Families that participated in community resource sharing faced lower individual risk of starvation while contributing to higher community-wide survival rates. Modern actuarial science studying medieval famine survival mathematics consistently finds sophisticated probability calculations and risk management strategies that achieved remarkable survival outcomes using systematic mathematical approaches to resource optimization and community cooperation. The numbers tell a story of human intelligence and cooperation triumphing over seemingly impossible mathematical challenges through systematic thinking, community organization, and precise resource management that maximized survival probability under extreme constraints. Here's the part that should make you pause mid-scroll. We've lost most of the survival knowledge that kept medieval communities alive during humanity's darkest periods. The people who knew how to turn tree bark into bread, who could identify dozens of edible plants by touch in complete darkness, who understood preservation chemistry without ever hearing the word chemistry. They took their knowledge to medieval graves, and we've been getting progressively more helpless ever since. Let's start with something that illustrates the scope of what we've lost. Plant identification knowledge that was once common among medieval children would now qualify someone as an expert botanist. Every village child knew which mushrooms were safe, which berries could be eaten raw versus cooked, Which tree barks provided nutrition versus medicine versus poisoning. This wasn't specialized knowledge, it was basic life skills, like knowing how to tie your shoes. The fermentation techniques that medieval women used to preserve foods and create safe beverages represented centuries of accumulated biochemistry knowledge that was never written down because everyone just knew it. They understood bacterial cultures, pH balance, and preservation chemistry at an intuitive level that modern food scientists spend years learning through formal education. But here's what's really tragic. The social technologies they developed for managing crisis cooperation were sophisticated systems for human organization that we can't fully reconstruct from historical records. We know these systems existed and that they were remarkably effective, but the specific protocols, communication methods, and social engineering techniques were transmitted through direct experience rather than written documentation. The diagnostic medical knowledge that medieval healers possessed was based on detailed observation skills and pattern recognition that required decades of training and experience. They could identify diseases, nutritional deficiencies, and health problems using only visual examination, conversation, and basic physical assessment. They understood symptom combinations and disease progression patterns that enabled accurate diagnosis without laboratory testing or modern diagnostic tools. The seasonal timing knowledge that guided medieval agricultural and foraging activities represented accumulated environmental observation over generations. They knew precisely when different plants would be ready for harvest, when weather patterns would shift, when animal behavior would indicate environmental changes. This knowledge was based on subtle environmental cues that required constant attention and multi-generational knowledge transmission. Modern people living in the same geographic areas often have no idea when wild foods are available, which environmental signs indicate weather changes, or how to predict seasonal patterns that were essential knowledge for medieval survival. We've traded environmental awareness for technological convenience, but the cost becomes apparent during any disruption of technological systems. The tool-making and repair knowledge that medieval craftspeople possessed enabled them to create, modify, and maintain essential equipment using only local materials and basic techniques. They understood metallurgy, woodworking, textile production, and material science at levels that enabled them to produce high-quality tools and equipment without industrial manufacturing. The precision of their craft knowledge was remarkable. They could identify metal quality by sound, assess wood strength by appearance and feel, and create complex mechanisms using only hand tools and traditional techniques. This knowledge required years of apprenticeship and hands-on experience that can't be replicated through book learning or video instruction. But perhaps most importantly, we've lost the integrated knowledge systems that combined multiple areas of expertise into comprehensive survival capabilities. Medieval people didn't just know individual skills, they understood how different types of knowledge connected and reinforced each other to create comprehensive survival systems. The food knowledge integrated botanical identification, nutritional understanding, preservation chemistry, cooking techniques, and storage management into unified systems that enabled communities to maintain food security under various conditions. Modern people might know individual pieces of this knowledge, but few understand the integrated systems that made the knowledge practically effective. The social knowledge integrated psychology, conflict resolution, resource management, leadership systems, and communication protocols into community organization methods that maintained social cooperation under extreme stress. We've lost most of the specific techniques they used for managing group decision-making, resolving disputes, and maintaining morale during extended hardship. The medical knowledge integrated herbal medicine, surgical techniques, psychological support, preventive care, and community health management into healthcare systems that provided comprehensive medical care using only local resources. Modern alternative medicine and wilderness first aid training capture some individual elements, but not the integrated systems that made medieval healthcare effective. The environmental knowledge integrated weather prediction, seasonal planning, resource management, ecological understanding, and agricultural timing into comprehensive systems for living sustainably within natural environments. Modern environmental science understands many of these elements individually, but has lost much of the integrated practical knowledge for actually living within ecological limits. The economic knowledge integrated resource valuation, trading protocols, credit systems, risk management, and cooperative organization into economic systems that provided security and stability without requiring external resources or technological infrastructure. We understand some of these elements theoretically, but have lost most of the practical knowledge for implementing alternative economic systems. But here's what makes the knowledge loss even more tragic. Much of it was lost not through catastrophic events, but through gradual abandonment, as communities became more dependent on external systems and less capable of local self-sufficiency. Each generation that didn't need to use survival knowledge was less likely to maintain and transmit it to their children. The urbanization and industrialization processes that provided greater security and convenience also created dependence on systems that are vulnerable to disruption. Communities traded local resilience and comprehensive survival knowledge for efficiency and convenience, but the trade-offs became apparent only during crisis periods when the external systems failed. Modern attempts to reconstruct medieval survival knowledge through historical research and experimental archaeology can recover some techniques, but can't fully replicate the integrated knowledge systems that required continuous practice and community transmission to maintain effectively. The knowledge that remains exists primarily in fragments. Individual techniques preserved by historical reenactors, traditional craft knowledge maintained by artisans, and folk medicine practices continued by herbalists. But the comprehensive, integrated systems that enabled entire communities to survive civilizational collapse are largely lost. The lesson that emerges from understanding this knowledge loss is both sobering and motivating. Human communities once possessed remarkable capabilities for resilience and self-sufficiency that we've traded for convenience and efficiency. The knowledge still exists in fragments and can potentially be recovered, but doing so requires recognizing its value and investing in the long-term learning and practice necessary to rebuild comprehensive survival capabilities. Let that settle in your mind as you drift towards sleep tonight. In the deepest darkness of human suffering, when death seemed inevitable and hope appeared foolish, medieval communities didn't just survive. They found ways to celebrate life, maintain dignity, and create beauty in the midst of horror. They proved that humanity's greatest strength isn't avoiding suffering, but transforming it into something that affirms rather than destroys the human spirit. The most remarkable thing about medieval famine survival wasn't the clever techniques or sophisticated strategies. It was the determination to remain human while doing whatever was necessary to stay alive. Communities that were slowly starving still held weddings, still told stories to their children, still found reasons to laugh and sing and celebrate small victories. They understood something we've forgotten, that surviving crisis requires preserving not just life, but the reasons that make life worth living. The festivals that continued during famine years weren't just stubborn denial of reality. They were sophisticated psychological technology for maintaining hope and social cohesion under impossible circumstances. Communities adapted their celebrations to work within severe resource constraints, while preserving the emotional and spiritual benefits that made those celebrations essential for community mental health. Harvest festivals during famine years celebrated foraging successes instead of grain harvests. Religious holidays focused on gratitude for survival and community support, rather than material abundance. Wedding celebrations used creativity and community cooperation to create joy and beauty without requiring resources that weren't available. They found ways to mark important life transitions and maintain cultural traditions that gave meaning and structure to human experience even during periods of extreme hardship. The storytelling traditions that flourished during famine reveal sophisticated understanding of the power of narrative to provide comfort, maintain hope, and transmit essential knowledge across generations. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were cultural technologies for preserving wisdom, providing psychological support, and maintaining community identity during periods when normal social life was disrupted. Children who grew up during famine learned stories that taught survival techniques, moral lessons about community cooperation, and cultural values that would guide their behavior throughout their lives. Adults shared stories that provided emotional comfort, maintained connection to cultural heritage, and offered hope for eventual recovery and better times ahead. The music and poetry that emerged from famine periods demonstrate remarkable creative resilience under conditions that might have been expected to crush artistic expression. Communities created songs that expressed their experiences, preserved their stories, and provided emotional release that helped maintain psychological health during extended hardship. But perhaps most importantly, the music served as a form of community communication. that reinforced social bonds and provided shared emotional experiences that reminded people of their common humanity and shared struggle. Singing together created psychological unity that strengthened community cooperation and provided individual comfort through collective participation. The acts of kindness and generosity that occurred during famine periods reveal the extraordinary capacity for human compassion, even under conditions of extreme resource scarcity. People who barely had enough food to keep themselves alive still found ways to share with neighbors, care for orphaned children, and support community members who were struggling more than they were. These weren't just individual acts of charity, they were systematic expressions of community values that recognized mutual dependence and collective responsibility for ensuring that everyone who could be saved would be saved. Communities that maintained these values during crisis periods were more likely to preserve social cohesion and achieve better survival outcomes for all their members. The religious and spiritual practices that sustained communities during famine provide profound insights into human capacity for finding meaning and maintaining faith during periods when physical reality seemed to contradict any possibility of divine benevolence or cosmic justice. People who were watching their children slowly starve still found reasons to pray, still maintained hope for eventual deliverance, still expressed gratitude for small mercies and minor improvements. But the spiritual responses weren't just passive acceptance or wishful thinking. They were active expressions of determination to maintain human dignity and moral behavior, even under conditions that might justify abandoning ethical standards. Communities that maintained their spiritual and moral foundations during crisis were more likely to preserve social cooperation and emerge from crisis with their cultural identity and community relationships intact. The educational activities that continued during famine demonstrate remarkable commitment to investing in future possibilities, even when immediate survival was uncertain. Parents who weren't sure they would live to see spring still took time to teach their children essential life skills. Communities that were using every available resource for immediate survival still maintained knowledge transmission activities that prepared future generations for recovery and prosperity. The children who learnt to read during famine years, who mastered traditional crafts while slowly starving, who received moral and cultural education during periods of extreme hardship, became the foundation for community recovery and future prosperity. The investment in education during crisis periods paid dividends that extended far beyond the immediate crisis period. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval famine survival was the determination to plan for recovery, even during the darkest periods of crisis. Communities that were barely surviving still maintained seed stocks for future planting, preserved breeding animals for livestock recovery, and planned reconstruction activities for when normal conditions returned. This wasn't just practical planning, it was an expression of faith in human resilience and determination to create better futures despite present suffering. Communities that maintained hope and continued planning for recovery were more likely to emerge from crisis stronger and more prosperous than they had been before the crisis began. The love stories that began during famine years, the children who were born and carefully nurtured during periods of extreme hardship, the artistic creations that emerged from suffering, all demonstrate that human beings have remarkable capacity for creating beauty, meaning, and joy, even under conditions that seem designed to crush hope and destroy happiness. Modern people facing personal or community crises can draw inspiration from medieval examples of communities that transformed suffering into wisdom, crisis into opportunity, and desperation into determination. The techniques they used for maintaining hope, preserving dignity, and creating meaning during extreme hardship remain relevant for anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember this. You descend from people who survived the impossible, who found light in absolute darkness, who created beauty in the midst of horror. Their strength flows through your veins, their wisdom lives in your DNA, and their determination to remain human under inhuman conditions is your birthright and your inheritance. If medieval peasants could turn tree bark into bread and find reasons to celebrate while slowly starving, maybe our modern problems aren't quite as impossible as they seem. Sweet dreams, survivors. Don't forget to appreciate that midnight snack. Your ancestors would be amazed. This script balances dark historical reality with gentle humor and bedtime-appropriate pacing, creating an engaging narrative that educates while entertaining. Perfect for the boring history for sleep format, while maintaining viewer engagement throughout the extended runtime.